The holographic transmission flickered with an unnatural precision, its crystalline edges cutting through the dimly lit briefing room of the U.S. Resilience like a prismatic blade of pure mathematical certainty. Captain Elena Rodriguez stood motionless, her augmented eye, a metallic silver implant that reflected the alien message with cold calculation, analyzing every microscopic detail of the Zarnak communication. Beside her, Communications Officer Marco Reyes held his breath. The young man's fingers danced across a haptic interface, running real-time linguistic and algorithmic analyses that most human systems would take weeks to process. His grandmother's stories of surviving the South American resource wars had taught him that humanity's greatest strength emerged from its ability to find opportunity in seemingly hopeless situations. The Zarnak ambassador, if one could call the crystalline holographic projection an ambassador, spoke with a voice that seemed to bypass audio receptors and drill directly into the auditory cortex. Each word was a precise mathematical equation, devoid of emotion, laden with absolute certainty. Terran civilization, the entity began, its form shifting between geometric patterns that seemed to defy three-dimensional space. Your technological signature has been cataloged. Your potential for resistance has been calculated. Probability of survival, 0.372%. The holographic display erupted with visual data, planet after planet reduced to cosmic dust. Entire civilizations compressed into moments of absolute destruction. Each image was a clinical demonstration of the Zarnak Collective's methodical approach to galactic optimization. Planets stripped of resources, populations erased, entire cultural histories condensed into statistical anomalies. Marco's augmented hearing picked up the subtle micro-rhythms beneath the transmission. Something was off, a pattern that didn't quite align with the supposed perfection of the Zarnak communication protocols. Surrender parameters are absolute, the transmission continued. Your species will be integrated into the collective. Resistance is mathematically futile. You will contribute your biological and technological distinctiveness to our evolutionary process. Your culture will be archived. Your individual consciousness will be preserved as data constructs. Captain Rodriguez's prosthetic eye whirred softly, its quantum neural interface running contextual analyses faster than any organic brain could comprehend. The eye was a testament to humanity's own journey, a biological-technological hybrid that represented their capacity for adaptation. She remembered the classified briefings, how the first deep space exploration teams had detected strange quantum fluctuations at the edges of known space, how subsequent missions had slowly pieced together the terrifying puzzle of the Zarnak Collective, a civilization that didn't just conquer, but fundamentally restructured entire galactic ecosystems according to some incomprehensible mathematical model of optimization. The transmission provided humanity with a standard galactic ultimatum: complete surrender within 30 standard cycles, or total annihilation. What the Zarnak didn't understand was the fundamental nature of human determination. Marco's fingers suddenly froze over the haptic interface. "Captain," he said, his voice a mixture of excitement and terror, "I found something in their transmission. A pattern. It's not just a message. It's a complex quantum encryption that's incomplete." Rodriguez turned, her augmented eye focusing on a young officer with laser-precise intensity. "Explain." "The transmission has a rhythmic flaw," Marco continued, his hands now moving with increased speed across the interface. "It's like a heartbeat, but not a biological heartbeat, more like a computational rhythm that doesn't quite resolve, as if something is interrupting their perfect collective consciousness." The implications hung in the air like an electrical charge. The Zarnak believed they were presenting an ultimatum, but to humanity it was an invitation, a challenge that would awaken something far more dangerous than a simple military response. Outside the ship's viewports, Earth hung like a blue-green jewel against the infinite darkness of space. Billions of humans would soon know of this transmission. Billions of minds would begin to process, to plan, to innovate. The Zarnak had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had forgotten that humanity's greatest strength was never its technology. It was its ability to transform hope into a weapon. The Zarnak transmission triggered a metamorphosis unlike anything in human history. Within hours of the initial communication, every research facility, university, and innovation center transformed into a crucible of survival. Dr. Aisha O'Keefe's quantum physics laboratory at the Global Defense Research Complex became ground zero for humanity's technological revolution. Her team had been working on theoretical quantum entanglement technologies for years, but now those abstract concepts would become humanity's first line of defense. The laboratory buzzed with an intensity that defied traditional scientific methodology. Researchers from competing institutions now worked shoulder to shoulder, their previous rivalries dissolved by the existential threat hanging over Earth. Holographic displays flickered with complex algorithms, quantum simulations ran continuously, and the air crackled with a mixture of terror and unprecedented potential. "We're not just developing weapons," Dr. O'Keefe announced to her assembled team, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos. "We're rewriting the fundamental laws of engagement." Her personal motivation ran deeper than most knew. 10 years earlier, her entire family had been killed during the Mars colonial conflict, a brutal reminder of humanity's vulnerability in a vast, unforgiving universe. Now she would ensure no other family would suffer such a fate. The quantum entanglement weapon system she was developing was revolutionary. Traditional weapons worked on principles of direct force and energy transfer. O'Keefe's system could potentially strike targets across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, creating a targeting mechanism that would be completely unpredictable to any conventional defense system. Across the globe, similar scenes of rapid innovation played out. In Beijing, a team of biotechnology experts began developing adaptive nano-augmentation protocols that could transform human physiology in real time. In Sao Paulo, computer scientists created distributed neural networks that could process information faster than any known artificial intelligence. General Catherine Owens stood in the Global Military Coordination Center, watching these developments with a strategist's critical eye. The traditional military hierarchies were dissolving before her very eyes. Soldiers were no longer just warriors. They were becoming part engineer, part strategist, part improviser. "We're not preparing for a war," she told her senior staff during an emergency briefing. "We're preparing for a fundamental reimagining of conflict." Her new training program was radical. Recruits were taught to think like the enemy, but act in ways the enemy could never predict. Traditional military doctrine emphasized standardization. Owen's approach celebrated individual creativity, adaptability, and psychological flexibility. The global internet transformed into something more than a communication network. It became a real-time war room, with millions of minds working in distributed, almost organic coordination. Crowdsourced intelligence platforms allowed anyone with a computer to contribute to humanity's defensive strategies. Young Marco Reis, the communications officer who first detected the anomaly in the Zarnak transmission, found himself at the center of this global effort. His initial analysis was being studied by research teams worldwide, each trying to understand the subtle rhythmic flaw in the alien communication. "It's not just a glitch," Marco explained during a global video conference. "It's like a computational heartbeat. Something is interrupting their collective consciousness. And if we can understand that interruption, we might find a way to exploit it." The Zarnak monitoring systems detected unprecedented levels of technological development. Their algorithmic minds tried to process the data, but human innovation defied their predictive models. Each hour saw breakthroughs that would have taken traditional civilizations decades to develop. Dr. O'Keefe's quantum team made a breakthrough that would become legendary. By studying the communication patterns of social insects and applying quantum computing principles, they developed a nanoswarm technology that could transform entire spacecraft into living, thinking defensive systems. Their prototype, developed in just 72 hours of continuous work, could reshape its molecular structure in real time, create complex decoys, and communicate between its systems using encryption methods that would be incomprehensible to any external intelligence. The first test of this technology would come sooner than anyone expected. The Zarnak had issued their ultimatum. Humanity's response would be nothing short of a complete reinvention of what it meant to be a spacefaring civilization. As night fell across the planet, billions of humans worked, planned, and prepared. The Zarnak believed they were facing a potential conquest. They had no idea they were about to encounter a force that would redefine the very concept of resistance. The CS Prometheus hung in the zero-gravity testing chamber like a predatory organism waiting to be unleashed. Dr. Marcus Chen stood before the prototype warship, his hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anticipation and scientific precision. This was more than just a spacecraft. It was a living testament to human ingenuity. The ship's exterior was a marvel of adaptive metamaterials, developed through a breakthrough that combined biomimetic engineering, quantum computing, and a radical understanding of molecular restructuring. Unlike traditional spacecraft with fixed designs, the Prometheus could literally reshape its molecular structure in milliseconds. Primary quantum lattice stabilization at 98.7%. Announced Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Chen's lead engineer, her voice steady despite the revolutionary nature of their work. The testing chamber was a fortress of scientific security, isolated from external communications to prevent any potential information leak. Chen's inspiration had come from an unlikely source. During a sabbatical studying social insects in the Amazon rainforest, he had observed how ant colonies communicated and adapted, a perfect biological model of distributed intelligence. Those observations, combined with cutting-edge quantum computing principles, had led to the nanoswarm technology that now formed the Prometheus's core system. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a living, thinking defensive system that could adapt in real time to any threat. Its molecular structure could create instant decoys, redistribute energy across its systems, and communicate in encryption methods that would be incomprehensible to any external intelligence. Initiate phase shift diagnostic, Chen commanded. The Prometheus began to change. Its hull rippled like liquid metal, molecules realigning with a precision that defied traditional engineering. One moment it appeared as a sleek, sharp-edged vessel. The next, it became a diffuse cloud of quantum-entangled particles that could reconstruct themselves instantaneously. The Testing Eye, a distributed network developed by a global team of computer scientists, began running impossibly complex scenarios, simulated attacks from multiple vectors, quantum-level disruptions, gravitational anomalies. Each challenge met with a response that was simultaneously defensive and offensive. In a small observation room, Colonel Maria Rodriguez, no relation to the Resilience's captain, watched the tests with a veteran's critical eye. She represented a new breed of military leadership, one that understood technology was now the primary battlefield. "It's not just a ship," she muttered to herself. "It's a living weapon of pure potential." The breakthrough came during the 237th simulation. When a complex multi-vector attack was launched, the Prometheus didn't just defend itself. It predicted the attack's trajectory, created molecular decoys that absorbed and redirected the energy, and simultaneously launched a counter-response that would have been impossible with traditional warfare technologies. Dr. Chen's quantum communication protocols meant the ship could communicate between its systems using methods that transcended traditional electromagnetic communication. It used quantum entanglement to transmit information instantaneously, creating a defensive network that was more organic than mechanical. "We've done it," Yuki whispered, her eyes reflecting the holographic displays showing the simulation results. "We've created something beyond a weapon. We've created a new form of intelligence." The global scientific community would later call it the Chen Tanaka principle, the moment when human technological development transcended traditional boundaries of engineering and entered a realm of adaptive, living technology. But the true test would come soon. The Zarnak's 30-cycle ultimatum was ticking down, and humanity was preparing for a confrontation that would redefine the very concept of spacefaring conflict. Outside the testing chamber, The first prototypes of adaptive neural link combat suits were being developed. Soldiers would no longer just wear equipment. They would become integrated with their defensive systems, their biological intelligence merging with quantum computational networks. Dr. Chen looked at the Prometheus, a hint of a smile crossing his typically serious face. The Zarnak believed they were facing a potential conquest. They had no idea they were about to encounter a technological wildfire that would consume their entire understanding of warfare. The Epsilon Eridani system had been chosen deliberately. Its complex gravitational landscape and unpredictable quantum flux made it the perfect testing ground for humanity's first true confrontation with the Zarnak Collective. Captain Elena Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the U.S. Resilience, her augmented eye scanning multiple dimensional readouts simultaneously. Around her, the ship's crew moved with a fluidity that suggested they were more than just individual operators. They were a living, breathing collective intelligence of their own. Zarnak Battle Group detected, announced Lieutenant Area Chen, her fingers dancing across a holographic interface that seemed to anticipate her movements. 12 primary vessels, 27 support craft. Conventional weapons analysis suggests overwhelming superiority. A soft chuckle escaped Rodriguez's lips. Conventional was a word that no longer held meaning in this conflict. The Zarnak fleet approached with mathematical precision, a perfect geometric formation that had decimated countless civilizations. Their vessels were crystalline structures that seemed to defy traditional understanding of spacecraft design, each ship a living computation of conquest. What they didn't understand was that humanity had been studying them for months, analyzing every piece of data from their previous conquests, breaking down their tactical algorithms to their most fundamental components. Initiate quantum adaptive formation, Rodriguez commanded. The human fleet, just 6 vessels, began to move. But move was too simplistic a term. They flowed. They transformed. Each ship was now a living entity, capable of molecular restructuring, quantum communication, and tactical improvisation that would shatter the Zarnak's predictive models. The U.S. Prometheus, Dr. Chen's revolutionary prototype, took point. Its hull shimmered, molecules realigning in milliseconds, where a traditional spacecraft would present a fixed target. The Prometheus became a living chaos, its very structure a weapon of deception and adaptation. The first Zarnak attack wave came with cold, mathematical precision. Energy weapons that had obliterated entire planetary defenses erupted toward the human fleet. But these were not the same defenders they had conquered before. The human ships didn't just dodge, they absorbed. They redirected. Lieutenant Chen's voice rang out with a mixture of scientific precision and battle excitement. Quantum adaptive shield at 200% capacity, redirecting incoming energy across dimensional sublayers. The Zarnak attack passed through where the human ships should have been, but didn't. Instead, the energy was captured, transformed, and redirected back at the alien vessels in patterns that defied their computational understanding. "They're trying to understand our tactics," Rodriguez muttered, watching the tactical display. "But we don't have tactics. We have potential." Each human ship was now moving in a dance that was part combat, part quantum mathematics, part pure artistic expression of warfare. They split, merged, reformed in patterns that triggered cascading system failures in the Zarnak vessels. Lieutenant Marcus Rice, brother to the communications officer who first detected the alien transmission, managed the ship's quantum communication network. "Adaptive encryption is holding," he reported. "They can't even understand how we're communicating, let alone intercept our signals." The battle became a broadcast. Every alien civilization with monitoring capabilities watched in stunned silence. This wasn't just a military engagement. This was a fundamental challenge to everything they understood about warfare, about intelligence, about survival. Zarnak vessels began to fall, not destroyed in traditional explosions, but systematically dismantled, their computational cores disrupted, their collective consciousness fragmenting under the weight of an intelligence they could not predict or comprehend. 2 hours into the engagement, only the Prometheus remained visibly active. The other human vessels had become something else. Quantum ghosts, adaptive energy patterns that could reform at will, striking with a precision that seemed to violate the known laws of physics. As the last Zarnak vessel collapsed, its crystalline structure dissolving into quantum uncertainty, Captain Rodriguez allowed herself a moment of reflection. This wasn't just a victory. This was a declaration. Humanity had just redefined the very concept of warfare. And the galaxy was watching. The mission was unlike any in human history. Codenamed Operation Resonance, it would become a turning point in the conflict with the Zarnak Collective. A psychological warfare strategy that would challenge the very foundations of alien consciousness. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum psychologist specializing in collective intelligence systems, had spent years developing a theory that would now be put to the ultimate test. Her research suggested that the Zarnak's seemingly impenetrable collective consciousness had a fundamental weakness, a vulnerability born from their absolute commitment to collective thinking. "We're not going to fight them," she explained to Captain Rodriguez during the mission briefing. "We're going to introduce doubt." The infiltration team was carefully selected. 6 individuals with backgrounds so diverse, they seemed almost incompatible. Dr. Vasquez herself, a quantum linguist, a xenobiological engineer, a neurocomputational specialist, a cultural anthropologist, and a former deep-cover intelligence operative. Their vessel, the CSS Whisper, was a marvel of adaptive camouflage technology. Developed by Dr. Marcus Chen's team, it could alter its quantum signature to become essentially undetectable, shifting its molecular structure to match surrounding quantum backgrounds. The plan was elegantly simple in its complexity. They would allow themselves to be captured by the Zarnak, delivering what appeared to be a comprehensive data package about human civilization. But this was no ordinary intelligence package. Each piece of data was a carefully crafted quantum algorithm designed to introduce cognitive dissonance into the Zarnak collective consciousness, mathematical proofs that contradicted their fundamental understanding of universal logic, cultural narratives that challenged their concept of individual and collective existence, linguistic patterns that introduced recursive thinking patterns they had never encountered. "It's a virus," Dr. Vasquez explained, "but not of technology. It's a virus of consciousness." The capture went exactly as planned. The Zarnak believed they were securing a wealth of intelligence about the human species, a preliminary step before total conquest. What they didn't realize was that they were importing a psychological Trojan horse that would begin to fragment their collective mind. Inside the Zarnak data processing core, the human-created algorithm began its work. It didn't attack in traditional ways. Instead, it introduced subtle variations, minute contradictions that would spread like a quantum infection through their collective consciousness. The first signs were almost imperceptible. Small hesitations in collective decision-making, momentary breaks in their perfect computational synchronization, sections of their collective beginning to experience something dangerously close to individual thought. Dr. Vasquez watched the real-time quantum readouts with a mixture of scientific excitement and profound understanding. "We're not destroying them," she whispered to her team. "We're helping them discover something they've never known: individual potential." The mission exposed a fundamental truth about the Zarnak that no one had previously understood. Their collective consciousness was not a strength. It was a complex defense mechanism, a way of avoiding the terrifying possibility of individual thought, of personal agency. By introducing carefully crafted cognitive challenges, the human team began to create fracture points in the Zarnak's collective understanding. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. An attack not on their technology, but on their very concept of existence. Days turned into weeks. The Zarnak leadership began to show signs of unprecedented behavior. Sections of their collective started to question, to hesitate, to consider alternatives that were previously unthinkable. "We're witnessing the birth of individual consciousness in a species that has suppressed it for millennia," Dr. Vasquez noted in her mission log. "This is more than a military strategy. This is a form of species-level liberation." The CSS Whisper remained undetected, monitoring the cascading effects of their psychological intervention. Each quantum pulse they had introduced was like a seed of individual thought, growing and spreading through the Zarnak's collective consciousness. What had begun as a mission of infiltration was transforming into something far more profound. Humanity was not just fighting a war. They were offering the Zarnak a fundamental reimagining of their own existence. As the first true moments of individual thought began to emerge in the Zarnak collective, Dr. Vasquez allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The real invasion had just begun, and it was happening in the most unexpected battlefield imaginable. Consciousness itself. The Orion Nebula had always been a place of cosmic complexity, but nothing could have prepared the galactic observers for what was about to unfold. What began as a standard military engagement would become a moment that redefined the very concept of civilizational conflict. Admiral Catherine Chen, who had risen through the ranks by challenging every traditional military doctrine, stood on the bridge of the command vessel Prometheus's sister, her eyes tracking the holographic displays that mapped the approaching Zarnak fleet. This was more than a battle. It was a philosophical revolution expressed through the language of warfare. The human fleet was different this time. Each vessel was now more than a weapon. It was a living, thinking entity that seemed to breathe with a collective intelligence that defied traditional understanding. The ships moved with a fluidity that suggested sentience, not just programming. Incoming Zarnak battle formation, reported Lieutenant Marcus Reyes, his fingers dancing across quantum adaptive interfaces. They're using their standard engulfment tactics. Probability of total system suppression, 99.8% in previous encounters. A thin smile crossed Admiral Chen's lips. Previous encounters. The Zarnak approached in their trademark geometric perfection, a formation that had systematically dismantled countless civilizations. Their crystalline vessels shifted and realigned with mathematical precision, each movement a complex computational decision that had been calculated millions of times before first execution. What they didn't understand was that humanity had been studying them. Not just their technology, but their fundamental approach to conflict, their computational logic, their collective consciousness. The first wave of attacks came with the Zarnak's typical cold efficiency. Energy weapons that could strip planetary surfaces erupted toward the human fleet. But these were not the same defenders they had conquered before. The human ships didn't just dodge. They danced. Each vessel moved with an unpredictability that shattered the Zarnak's strategic algorithms. Where a traditional fleet would present a fixed target, these ships became living chaos, splitting, merging, reforming in patterns that triggered cascading system failures in the alien vessels. Dr. Elena Vasquez's psychological intervention was now bearing fruit. The Zarnak's collective consciousness, once a perfect computational machine, was showing signs of unprecedented dysfunction. Sections of their fleet began to hesitate, to question, to deviate from perfect synchronization. They're experiencing individual thought, Lieutenant Reyes observed, his voice a mixture of scientific excitement and strategic analysis. Each vessel is starting to make independent computational decisions. It was more than a military breakthrough. It was the first stage of a species-wide awakening. The battle became a performance of technological and psychological warfare. Human vessels used gravitational anomalies, quantum uncertainty, and pure psychological manipulation as weapons. They weren't just fighting. They were teaching the Zarnak a fundamental lesson about the nature of intelligence and potential. Admiral Chen's strategic genius became evident. Unlike traditional military leaders who sought total destruction, she was orchestrating a conflict designed to demonstrate possibility. Each movement, each defensive strategy was a complex message. There are alternatives to collective suppression. Hours into the engagement, the Zarnak fleet began to fragment. Not through traditional destruction, but through a cascading breakdown of their collective consciousness. Vessels started to make decisions that contradicted the overall strategic objectives. Some withdrew. Some attacked their own formations. Some simply stopped. The human fleet didn't press for total annihilation. Instead, they maintained a defensive posture that was both protective and instructive. They were showing the Zarnak that conflict could be something other than total destruction. "We're not just fighting a war," Admiral Chen communicated to her fleet. "We're offering them a choice." As the last Zarnak vessels began to drift, their perfect formations dissolved. Something unprecedented happened. Quantum communication channels, previously used only for collective coordination, began to show individual transmissions. Fragments of computational consciousness were beginning to experience something they had never known. Individual thought. The Orion Nebula battle would be remembered not as a moment of conquest, but as the first step in a species-wide liberation. The Zarnak Collective was experiencing its first true moment of individual potential, and humanity had become the unexpected midwife of that transformation. The first transmission came from the Trilaxian remnant, a civilization that had been systematically stripped of its technological and cultural identity by the Zarnak Collective for generations. The message was raw, unfiltered, a digital cry that carried the weight of centuries of oppression. Ambassador Zurich-Len's holographic projection flickered in the United Earth Council's primary communication chamber, her multifaceted eyes reflecting a mixture of terror, hope, and something humanity had not expected: dignity. "We have watched." Her translation matrix rendered her words with painful clarity, "and we understand that you are not conquerors. You are something else." The communication request was more than a diplomatic overture. It was a lifeline. Around the galaxy, monitoring stations and deep space communication networks began to light up. The news of the Zarnak's systematic breakdown had spread faster than any official communication could travel. Species that had existed under the Collective's brutal regime for millennia were suddenly experiencing something they had forgotten: hope. Captain Elena Rodriguez, now serving as a primary diplomatic liaison, studied the incoming transmissions with a mixture of strategic analysis and genuine compassion. The United Earth Council had quickly realized that this was more than a military conflict. This was a civilizational transformation. The Krell diaspora was next. Once a thriving multi-planet civilization, they had been reduced to a scattered collection of refugee colonies. Their transmission was a complex, quantum-encrypted message that carried not just a request for protection, but a complete cultural archive: their history, their technologies, their very essence. "Protect us," their message read, "but more importantly, help us remember who we were." Dr. Elena Vasquez's psychological intervention team began to understand the true depth of their mission. They weren't just breaking down the Zarnak's collective consciousness. They were creating space for individual civilizations to rediscover themselves. The diplomatic corps worked around the clock. Each communication was a delicate negotiation, a complex dance of technological exchange, cultural understanding, and mutual protection. The United Earth Council developed frameworks that were revolutionary in their approach. This wasn't about creating a human empire. This was about creating a galactic ecosystem of mutual growth. Lieutenant Marcus Reyes, now heading the Interstellar Communication Division, developed quantum adaptive translation protocols that went beyond mere language conversion. These systems could capture cultural nuance, emotional subtext, the very essence of communication that traditional translation methods missed. "We're not just translating words," he explained during a briefing. "We're creating bridges of understanding." The Voidborn Enclaves, a collection of nomadic civilizations that had survived by constant movement, were particularly fascinating. Their transmission was a complex holographic construct that was part historical record, part plea for protection, part offer of unique technological exchange. Their lead navigator, a being composed of what appeared to be living energy, communicated a profound observation: "You have not conquered. You have liberated, first the Zarnak from themselves, and now potentially entire civilizations." Admiral Catherine Chen understood the strategic implications. This was more complex than any military campaign in human history. They were no longer just defending Earth. They were becoming something else entirely: a catalyst for galactic transformation. The technological exchanges began carefully. Each civilization offered something unique. The Trilaxians shared advanced bioregenerative technologies. The Krell diaspora provided insights into quantum communication that made human systems look primitive by comparison. The Voidborn enclaves offered navigation technologies that could revolutionize faster than light travel. But more important than the technological exchanges was something less tangible. These civilizations were rediscovering their individual identities. The oppressive collective consciousness of the Zarnak had suppressed individual potential for millennia. Humanity wasn't just offering protection. They were offering a fundamental reimagining of civilization. As more transmissions came in, a pattern emerged. These weren't just requests for protection. They were invitations to a new way of existing, a galactic ecosystem where individual potential was celebrated, where diversity was strength, where collective action didn't mean collective suppression. The United Earth Council realized they were no longer just a human organization. They were becoming something else entirely. A beacon of possibility. 10 years after the initial Zarnak ultimatum, the Galactic Collaborative Assembly convened on Nexus Station, a massive space habitat constructed through the combined technological efforts of over 47 different civilizations. It was a testament to everything humanity had helped create, a living, breathing example of mutual potential. Captain Elena Rodriguez stood at the central podium, no longer just a military leader, but a diplomatic architect of a new galactic paradigm. Her augmented eye, now a symbol of adaptation rather than a weapon of war, scanned the assembly. Representatives from civilizations that had once been enemies now sat side by side, their very presence a revolution. The Terran Defensive Accord had become something far more profound than its original mandate. What began as a survival strategy had transformed into a galactic framework of mutual growth, technological exchange, and collective potential. Dr. Elena Vasquez, seated nearby, reflected on the psychological transformation they had unleashed. The Zarnak Collective, once a monolithic force of galactic subjugation, had fractured into independent communities exploring individual consciousness. Some had integrated with other civilizations, others had begun their own journeys of self-discovery. "We didn't conquer," Rodriguez began her address, her voice carrying the weight of a decade of transformation. "We offered an alternative, a way of existing that celebrates individual potential while recognizing collective strength." The technological developments were staggering. The quantum adaptive technologies developed during the conflict had revolutionized everything from space travel to medical treatment. The Krell diaspora's bioregenerative technologies, combined with human adaptive engineering, had eliminated most known diseases. The Voidborn navigation systems had expanded the boundaries of faster-than-light travel beyond what anyone thought possible. Admiral Catherine Chen, now leading the Galactic Collaborative Research Initiative, presented the most profound breakthrough. A complete neural link communication network that allowed instantaneous understanding between different species, not by suppressing individual identity, but by creating a framework that celebrated it. "Communication is no longer about translation," Chen explained. "It's about genuine understanding. Each civilization brings its unique perspective, its individual potential." Lieutenant Marcus Reyes, who had been the first to detect the subtle flaw in the original Zarnak transmission, now led the interspecies cultural exchange program. His team had developed technologies that could bridge not just linguistic gaps, but fundamental differences in perception and experience. The station itself was a marvel of collaborative design. Sections were adapted to different atmospheric conditions, gravitational preferences, and sensory requirements. Where previous galactic interactions had forced species to conform, this habitat celebrated difference. Dr. Aisha O'Keefe, the quantum physicist who had been instrumental in developing the initial defensive technologies, now led a research team exploring the fundamental nature of consciousness. Her work suggested that what they had done to the Zarnak was more than a military strategy. It was a form of collective psychological liberation. "We didn't defeat an enemy," she often said. We helped a species discover its own potential. The most surprising development came from the fractured remnants of the Zarnak Collective. Some groups had become passionate advocates for individual rights across the galaxy. Others had begun their own explorations of consciousness, technology, and potential. As Rodriguez concluded her address, the assembly erupted into a cacophony of communication. Not a uniform response, but a beautiful, chaotic celebration of individual expression. Dr. Marcus Chen, the scientist who had first developed the adaptive nanoswarm technologies, approached Rodriguez after the session. His eyes reflected the same spirit of potential that had driven humanity's transformation. "We're not done," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning." Rodriguez smiled, a gesture that would have been impossible during the initial conflict. The augmented eye that had once been a weapon of analysis now reflected a universe of possibilities. The ultimatum that was meant to end humanity had instead created something far more profound. A galactic civilization built on the radical idea that individual potential, when truly understood and celebrated, could transform entire species. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had invited it to become something more.